Welcome back to History 101. My name is Christina Paris. I'm your instructor for this course. And today we're going to be covering Chapter 19, American Empire. So let's go ahead and get this presentation up here. This is Chapter 19. And share that with you. And go ahead and put the slideshow on from beginning. There we go. So as you can see, if you're following along with the slide printout, this is slide number 1, which is our title slide of the presentation. So as you can see, Chapter 19, American Empire. The next page, our next slide, slide number 2, is the table of contents for this lecture. We'll have a video clip in the first section. The next section after that will be the actual lecture, and then finally, the interactive activity. So video clip number 1, section number 1. So this is slide number 3. Slide number 4 is the actual video clip, which is the complexity of Emilio Aguinaldo. And the link is right there. If you can't click on it, if it won't work, the address is there. So you can type in the address and it will take you actually to the video link. So go ahead. Slide number 5 is the introductory slide to the actual lecture itself. And then we go into our lecture, which is Patterns of American Interventions. So American interventions in Mexico, China, and the Middle East reflected the United States' new eagerness to intervene ultimately in foreign governments to protect American economic interests abroad. Now, the United States had long been involved in Pacific commerce. American ships had been traveling to China, for instance, since 1784. As a percentage of the total American foreign trade, Asian trade remained comparatively small. And yet, the idea that Asian markets were vital to American commerce affected American policy, and when those markets were threatened, prompted interventions. In 1899, Secretary of State John Hay articulated the open door policy, which called for all Western powers to have equal access to Chinese markets. Hay feared that the other imperial powers, such as Japan, Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, and Russia, planned to carve up China into spheres of influence. It was in the economic interest of America business to maintain China for free trade. The following year, in 1900, American troops joined a multinational force that intervened to prevent the closing of trade by putting down what was known as the Boxer Rebellion, a movement opposed to foreign businesses and missionaries operating in China. Now, President McKinley sent the U.S. Army in without consulting Congress, setting a precedent for U.S. presidents to order American troops to action around the world under their executive powers. And you'll see this is currently being utilized by our present administration, whether we agree with it or not. Excuse me for a minute while I adjust myself here. I realize I'm not showing much. So the United States not only ready to intervene in foreign affairs to preserve foreign markets, it was willing to take territory. Now, it acquired its first Pacific territories, which was with what was known as the Guano Islands Act of 1856. Now, does anybody know what guano is? Well, it's collected bird excrement. So imagine this. We're going around asking these different Pacific islands, do you have bird poop? Yeah, we have big mounds of it back there. Why? Oh, great. Guano, that's what we need. I'm sure the native peoples probably thought we were a little bit crazy. It was a popular fertilizer integral to industrial farming. The act authorized and encouraged Americans to venture into the seas and claim islands with guano deposits for the United States. These acquisitions were the first insular, unincorporated territories of the United States. They were neither part of a state nor a federal district, and they were not on the path to ever attain such a status. The act, though little known, offered a precedent for future American acquisitions. Merchants, of course, weren't the only American travelers in the Pacific. Christian missionaries soon followed explorers and traders. The first American missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1820 and China in 1830, for example. Missionaries, though, often worked alongside business interests, and American missionaries in Hawaii, for instance, obtained large tracts of land and started lucrative sugar plantations. During the 19th century, Hawaii was ruled by an oligarchy based on the sugar corporations. During the 19th century, Hawaii was ruled by an oligarchy based on the sugar companies, together known as the Big Five. This white American haole elite was extremely powerful, but they still operated outside the formal expression of American state power. Now, we will say that these officials, these gentlemen, these, if you call them gentlemen, of these sugar companies recognized that they wanted to increase their power of their companies. They wanted to take full control of Hawaii, of the land that was available. And the Hawaiian ruling royal family that was controlling that land was limiting them. Well, they knew that they could gain support for their endeavors if Hawaii was to become under the control of the United States. And they also knew that the United States was eyeing Hawaii because of its strategic position out in the Pacific. As we will see, this leads to the eventual annexation of Hawaii, and the brutal deposition of the final queen of Hawaii. But I'm getting ahead of myself as usual. So, as many Americans looked for empire across the Pacific, others looked to Latin America. The United States, long participated in an increasingly complex network of economic, social, and cultural interactions in Latin America, entered the late 19th century with a new, aggressive, and interventionist attitude toward its southern neighbors. American capitalism invested enormous sums of money in Mexico during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During the long reign of the corrupt yet stable regime of the modernization hungry president Porfirio Diaz. But in 1910, the Mexican people revolted against Diaz, ending his authoritarian regime, but also his friendliness towards the business interests of the United States. In the midst of this terrible destruction wrought by the fighting, Americans with investment interests pleaded for governmental help. One second. What can I get this up here? Right, let's resume. American capitalists invested enormous sums of money in Mexico during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. During the long reign of the corrupt yet stable regime of the modernization hungry President Porfirio Diaz. But in 1910, the Mexican people revolted against Diaz, ending his authoritarian regime, but also his friendliness toward the business interests of the United States. In the midst of the terrible destruction wrought by the fighting, Americans with investment interests pleaded for governmental help. But the U.S. government tried to control events and politics that could not be controlled. More and more American businessmen called for military intervention. When the brutal strongman Victoriano Huerta executed the revolutionary, democratically elected President Francisco Madero in 1913, newly inaugurated President Woodrow Wilson put pressure on Mexico as the new government and demanded that Huerta step aside and allow free elections to take place. Now, we've got to think, did Huerta necessarily go, oh, sure, guys, I'm going to let the elections take place? Or did he cling brutally to power? Well, he refused. Ultimately, the demands of the United States. So, when Mexican forces mistakenly arrested American sailors in the port city of Tampico in April of 1914, and we've got to think how that might have gone down. Um, Obviously, sailors on shore leave might have gotten into a brief altercation, an altercation over misunderstandings in a bar. Maybe the Mexican government was just looking for a reason to imprison American sailors, whatever the case was. Wilson saw the opportunity to apply additional pressure on Huerta. Huerta refused to make amends, and Wilson therefore asked Congress for authority to use force against Mexico. But even before Congress could respond, Wilson invaded and took the port city of Veracruz to prevent, he said, a German shipment of arms from reaching Huerta's forces. Now, we're thinking about this. Why would he be so concerned about German arms reaching Huerta's forces? It's 1914. What is going on by 1914? Let's say elsewhere in the world, perhaps somewhere in Europe. Well, given this particular time, what is actually broken out in Europe? World War I has broken out. Wilson is aware that there is a conflict going on, that there is a conflict involving the Germans. He's also aware that the Germans are wanting to involve as many of the world powers as possible in this conflict. And he sees that they might want to instigate an altercation with dragging the United States into this conflict. There's long-standing bad blood between the countries that goes back for generations. So let's look at this. He sees that this possibility is there. And if you remember correctly, the United States isn't going to get involved in World War I until the very last 18 months of the war. We enter the war very late. So he's concerned about these weapons getting to Huerta's forces, to the possibility of Mexico becoming armed by the Germans to possibly invade, possibly start a war, which we'll get to the reasons why that might have been a valid concern. And anyway, the Huerta government fell in July of 1914. And the American occupation lasted until November, when Vestenio Carranza, a rival of Huerta, took power. Now, when Wilson threw American support behind Carranza, which, okay, it seems like everything's going to go right. No, not by a long shot. And not his more radical and now rival Pancho Villa. Villa and several hundred supporters attacked American interests and raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico in March 1916, and killed over a dozen soldiers and civilians. Wilson, now upset by Villa, who's attacked Columbus, New Mexico, decides that he's going to order a punitive expedition of several thousand soldiers led by one of the best generals that we have in our military, who happens to be General John J. Blackjack Pershing. Um, and he authorizes him to enter northern Mexico and capture Villa. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, he's going to go in there with these thousands of soldiers. He's going to capture Villa. But Villa actually manages to elude Pershing for nearly a year. And ultimately, in 1917, with war in Europe looming and great injury done to U.S. Mexican relations, Pershing leaves Mexico. So the United States action during the Mexican Revolution reflected longstanding American policy that justified interventionist actions in Latin American politics because of their potential bearing on the United States, on citizens, on shared territorial borders, and perhaps most significantly on economic investments. This example highlights the role of geography or perhaps proximity in the pursuit of imperial outcomes. But American interactions in more distant locations in the Middle East, for instance, looks quite different. Now, the US government had traditionally had little contact with the Middle East. Trade was limited, too limited for an economic relationship to be deemed vital to the national interests. But treaties were nevertheless signed between the U.S. and powers in the Middle East. Still, the majority of American involvement in the Middle East prior to World War I came not in the form of trade, but in education, science, and humanitarian aid. American missionaries led the way. The first Protestant missionaries had arrived in 1819. Soon, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions and the boards of missions of the Reformed Church of America became dominant in missionary enterprises. Missions were established in almost every country of the Middle East, and even though their efforts resulted in relatively few converts, missionaries helped establish hospitals and schools, and their work laid the foundation for the establishment of Western style universities, such as Robert College in Istanbul, Turkey in 1863, the American University of Beirut in 1866, and the American University of Cairo in 1919. So, ultimately, we now come to a pivotal year in this time frame. If I can get my slide presentation to advance. Come on. Let's go. Let's advance. All right. So 1898, slide 7, a pivotal year for the United States. Although the United States had a long history of international economic, military, and cultural engagement that stretched back deep into the 18th century, the Spanish American and Philippine American Wars from 1898 to 1902 marked a crucial turning point in American interventions abroad. In pursuing war with Spain and then engaging in counter-revolutionary conflict in the Philippines, the United States expanded the scope and strength of its global reach. Over the next 2 decades, the United States would become increasingly involved in international politics, particularly in Latin America. These new conflicts and ensuing territorial problems forced Americans to confront the ideological elements of imperialism and ultimately question whether the United States should be an imperialistic power. So in 1898, Americans began in earnest to turn their attention southward to the problems plaguing their neighbor, Cuba. Now, what's going on in Cuba, do you think? Well, let's find out what's going on in Cuba. Since the middle of the 19th century, Cubans had tried unsuccessfully again and again to gain independence from Spain. The latest uprising, and the one that would prove fatal to Spain's colonial designs, began in 1895 and was still raging in the winter of 1898. By that time, in an attempt to crush the uprising, Spanish General Valeriano Weyler y Nicolau had been conducting a policy of reconcentration, forcing Cubans living in certain cities to relocate en masse to military camps for about 2 years. Now, this is where there is certain debate about how bad the situation was. Obviously, you put people in a reconcentration camp just in the name alone. Things are not good. The situation is not good. You're imprisoning innocent people. Right there, bad. How bad the situation was, we're not sure because the sensationalist media of the day picks up on it. And ultimately, prominent newspaper publishers sensationalized these Spanish atrocities. Cubans in the United States and their allies raised cries of Cuba Libre. And when the U.S. government proclaimed a wish to avoid armed conflict with Spain, President McKinley became increasingly concerned about the safety of American lives and property in Cuba. Didn't matter so much about the Cubans that were being put in a reconcentration camp. No, it's more about those, again, economic interests and Americans that are down there. That's far more concerning, right? So, anyway, he ordered the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor in January of 1898. All right, so the Maine is in Havana Harbor in 1898. January specifically. Now, the Maine sat undisturbed in the harbor for about 2 weeks. Then, on the evening of February 15, a titanic explosion tore open the ship and sent it to the bottom of the ocean. 3/4 of the ship's 354 occupants died. Now, immediately after this, claims are made it was torpedoed. There was some kind of, you know, shell fired at it from the shoreline that split it in half. Well, this has lasted for decades. In recent years, and I'm going to tell you this story right now. Some historians, some scientists decided they wanted to dispel these, find out the real cause of what sank the Maine. This is like part of our narrative, our historical narrative. What got us into the Spanish-American War, what got us ultimately into the far bloodier Philippine-American War. So ultimately, what really happened to the Maine? They dive down. And the first thing they find when they go inside the hull of the ship, besides, obviously remains of some of the sailors that were still there, is loads of munitions, explosives. And then they notice something peculiar about the blast that tore the ship open. Now, if this had truly been a torpedo, a shell fired at it, whatever, the blast would have gone inward. The initial, that would have shown some kind of impact before it blew open. But there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing that shows that it was impacted by anything. However, there's clear evidence, definitive evidence, that there was a massive explosion from inside the ship that blew the ship open. And when they find evidence from within the ship that there were munitions that appeared that detonated, especially close to the point where the blast would have originated and where everything shows that the hole buckled out and everything. Scientists begin to realize that the main was actually blown apart by an internal explosion. The Spanish never fired on the main, as the sensationalist media claimed. It was an internal explosion that tore the ship apart. There may have been a spark. There may have been, something going on with some of the munitions. They were unstable. And somebody may have been illicitly down there smoking and dropped their butts near where there were fuses that were sitting too close to the munitions that blew the munitions open. Whatever the case may be, this sets off the Spanish-American War. Now, as we find, a Naval Board of Inquiry immediately began an investigation to ascertain the cause of the explosion. But the loudest Americans had already decided that Spanish treachery was to blame. Capitalizing on the outrage, yellow journals, newspapers that promoted sensational stories, notoriously at the cost of accuracy, such as William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, called for war with Spain. When urgent negotiations failed to produce a mutually agreeable settlement, Congress officially declared war on April 25th. So, ultimately, we have war declared. So, although America's war effort began haphazardly, Spain's decaying military crumbled. Military victories for the United States came quickly. In the Pacific on May 1st, Commodore George Dewey engaged the Spanish fleet outside Manila, the capital of the Philippines, another Spanish colonial possession, destroyed it, and proceeded to blockade Manila Harbor. 2 months later, American troops took Cuba's San Juan Heights in what would become the most well known battle of the war, winning fame not for regular soldiers, but for the irregular, especially Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Roosevelt had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but had resigned his position in order to see action in the war. His actions in Cuba made him a national celebrity. As disease began to eat away at American troops, the Spanish suffered the loss of Santiago de Cuba on July 17th, effectively ending the war. The two nations agreed to a ceasefire on August 12 and formally signed the Treaty of Paris in December. The terms of the treaty stipulated, among other things, that the United States would acquire Spain's former holdings of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So we ultimately gain these three colonial possessions. Now, Secretary of State John Hay memorably referred to the conflict as a splendid little war, and at the time it certainly appeared that way. Fewer than 400 Americans died in battle in a war that lasted about 15 weeks. Contemporaries celebrated American victories as the providential act of God. The influential Brooklyn minister Lyman Abbott, for instance, declared that Americans were an elect people of God and saw divine providence in Dewey's victory at Manila. Some, such as Albert J. Beveridge of Indiana, took matters one step further, seeing in American victory an opportunity for imperialism. In Beveridge's view, America had a mission to perform and a duty to discharge around the world. What Beveridge envisioned was nothing less than American empire. So, but the question of whether the United States should become an empire was sharply debated across the nation in the aftermath of the Spanish American War and the acquisition of Hawaii that came in July of 1898. At the behest of American businessmen who had overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy, the United States annexed the Hawaiian Islands and their rich plantations. Between Hawaii and a number of former Spanish possessions, many Americans coveted the economic and political advantages that increased territory would bring. Those opposed to expansion, however, worried that imperial ambitions did not accord with the nation's founding ideals. Face it, we were a colonial power, folks. We were a colony. A colonial power, we had a colonial power over us, which was Great Britain. So, aren't we kind of calling the kettle black when we threw off the shackles of tyranny, as we called it, to break free of being a colony of Great Britain, to be an independent nation founded on independence, democracy, all this, swearing that we would fight to keep other nations free, and then we turn around and we hold empires. We create an empire ourselves. So we're holding people under the same system that we broke free from. Kind of seems contradictory, doesn't it? So, those opposed to expansion, however, worry that imperial ambitions did not accord with the nation's founding ideals. American actions in the Philippines brought all of these discussions to a head. Now, the Philippines were an afterthought of the Spanish American War. But when the smoke cleared, the United States found itself in possession of a key foothold in the Pacific. After Dewey's victory over the Spanish fleet in the Battle of Manila Bay, conversations about how to proceed occupied the attention of President McKinley, political leaders from both parties, and the popular press. American and Philippine forces, under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, were in communication. Would the Americans offer their support to the Filipinos and their ongoing efforts against the Spanish, or would the Americans replace the Spanish as a colonial occupying force? And the American forces were instructed to secure Manila without allowing Philippine forces to enter the walled city, which was the seat of the Spanish colonial government, hinting perhaps at things to come. Americans wondered what would happen next. Perhaps a good many ordinary Americans shared the bewildered sentiments of Mr. Dooley, the fictional Irish American barkeeper who humorist Finley Peter Dunne used to satirize American life. I don't know what I do with the Philippines any more than I did last summer before I heard tell I them. We can't sell them, we can't eat them, we can't throw them away into the alley with no one is looking. As debates about American imperialism continued against the backdrop of an upcoming presidential election, tensions in the Philippines escalated. Emilio Aguinaldo was inaugurated as president of the Philippine Republic. This is slide 8, excuse me. Emilio Aguinaldo was inaugurated as president of the First Philippine Republic, or Malolos Republic, in late July 1899. Fighting between American and Philippine forces began in early February, and in April 1899, Congress ratified the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which concluded the Spanish-American War and gave Spain 20 million in exchange for the Philippine Islands. Now, wait a second. We just got $20 million for the Philippine Islands, and we're fighting a war with the Filipinos. Yeah. Like the Cubans, Filipinos had waged a long war against their Spanish colonizers. The United States could have given them the independence they had long fought for, but instead, at the behest of President William McKinley, the United States occupied the islands and from 1899 to 1902 waged a bloody series of conflicts against Filipino insurrectionists that cost far more lives than the war with Spain. Under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, Filipinos who had fought for freedom against the Spanish now fought for freedom against the very nation that had claimed to have liberated them from Spanish tyranny. The Philippine Insurrection, or Philippine American War, was a brutal conflict of occupation and insurgency. Contemporaries compared the guerrilla style warfare in challenging and unfamiliar terrain to the American experiences in the so called Indian Wars of the late 19th century. Many commented on its brutality and uncertain mission of American troops. An American dispatch from Harper's Weekly correspondent began: "A week has passed, a week of fighting and marching, of jungles and rivers, of incident and adventure so varied and of so rapid transition that to sit down to write about it makes one feel as if he were trying to describe a dream where time, space, and all logical sequences of ordinary life are upset in the unrelenting brutality of war." John Bass described his experiences in detail, and his reportage combined with accounts that came directly from soldiers helped shape public knowledge about the war. Reports of cruelty on both sides and a few high profile military investigations ensured continued public attention to events across the Pacific. Amid fighting to secure the Philippine Islands, the federal government sent two Philippine commissions to assess the situation in the islands and make recommendations for a civilian colonial government. A civilian administration with William H. Taft as the first governor general from 1901 to 1903 was established with military support. Although President Theodore Roosevelt declared the war to be over in 1902, resistance and occasional fighting continued into the second decade of the 20th century. Debates about American imperialism dominated headlines and tapped into core ideas about American identity and the proper role of the United States in the larger world. Should a former colony established on the principles of freedom, liberty, and sovereignty become a colonizer itself? What was imperialism anyway? Many framed the Filipino conflict as a Protestant civilizing mission. Others framed American imperialism in the Philippines as nothing new, as simply the extension of a never ending westward American expansion. It was simply destiny. Some saw imperialism as a way to re energize the nation by asserting national authority and power around the globe. Others boldly recognized the opportunities Philippine Islands presented for access to Asian markets. But critics grew louder. The American Anti Imperialism League, founded in 1899 and populated by such prominent Americans as Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and Jane Addams, protested American imperial actions and articulated a platform that decried foreign subjugation and upheld the rights of all to self-governance. Still others embraced anti-imperialist stances because of concerns about immigration and American racial identity. Now, afraid that American purity stood imperiled by contact with strange and foreign peoples. For whatever reason, however, the onset of acceleration of imperialism was a controversial and landmark moment in American history. America had become a preeminent force in the world. So, it brings us to the next section: Theodore Roosevelt and American imperialism. Slide number 9. So, under the leadership of President Theodore Roosevelt, the United States emerged from the 19th century while ambitious designs on global power through military might, territorial expansion, and economic influence. Though the Spanish American War had begun under the administration of William McKinley, Roosevelt, the hero of the San Juan Hill, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Vice President, and President, was arguably the most visible and influential proponent of American imperialism at the turn of the century. Roosevelt's emphasis on developing the American Navy and on Latin America as a key strategic area of U.S. foreign policy would have long term consequences. In return for Roosevelt's support of the Republican nominee, William H. McKinley, in the 1896 presidential election, McKinley appointed Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The head of the department, John Long, had a competent but lackadaisical managerial style that allowed Roosevelt a great deal of freedom, which he used to network with such luminaries as military theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan and naval officer George Dewey, and politicians such as Henry Cabot Lodge and William Howard Taft. During his tenure, he never oversaw the construction of new battleships and the implementation of new technology and laid the groundwork for new shipyards, all with the goal of projecting America's power across the oceans. Roosevelt wanted to expand American influence. Um, for instance, he advocated for the annexation of Hawaii for several reasons. It was within the American sphere of influence. It would deny Japanese expansion and limit potential threats to the West Coast. It had an excellent port for battleships at Pearl Harbor, and it would act as a fueling station on the way to pivotal markets in Asia. Roosevelt, after winning headlines in the war, ran as vice president under McKinley and rose to the presidency after McKinley's assassination by the anarchist Leon Trotsky in 1901. Among his many interventions in American life, Roosevelt acted with vigor to expand the military, bolstering naval power, especially to protect and promote American interests abroad. This included the construction of the 11 battleships between 1904 and 1907. Alfred Thayer Mahan's naval theories, described in his The Influential of Sea Power Upon History, influenced Roosevelt a great deal. In contrast to theories that advocated for commerce raiding, coastal defense, and small brown water ships, the imperative to control the sea required battleships and a blue water navy that could engage and win decisive battles with rival fleets. As President Roosevelt continued the policies he established as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and expanded the U.S. fleet. The mission of the Great White Fleet, 16 all white battleships that sailed around the world between 1907 and 1909, exemplified America's new power. Roosevelt insisted that the big stick and the persuasive power of the U.S. military could ensure U.S. hegemony over strategically important regions in the Western Hemisphere. The United States used military interventions in various circumstances in further circumstances to further its objectives, but it did not have the ability to or the inclination to militarily impose its will on the entirety of South and Central America. The United States, therefore, more often used informal methods of empire, such as so called dollar diplomacy, which we'll be talking about dollar diplomacy in a little while. So don't freak out if you don't know what dollar diplomacy is or you're looking for a definition right now. Make a note, highlight, underline, do whatever you need to that you're looking for the definition later on in the lecture. To assert dominance over the hemisphere. The United States actively intervened again and again in Latin America. Throughout his entire in office, Roosevelt exerted U.S. control over Cuba, even after it gained formal independence in 1902, and Puerto Rico, and he deployed naval forces to ensure Panama's independence from Colombia in 1903 in order to acquire a U.S. canal zone. Furthermore, Roosevelt pronounced the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, proclaiming U.S. police power in the Caribbean. As articulated by President James Monroe in his annual address to Congress in 1823, the United States would treat any military intervention in Latin America by European power as a threat to American security. Roosevelt reaffirmed the Monroe Doctrine and expanded it by clarifying that the United States had the right to preemptive action through intervention in any Latin American nation in order to correct administrative and fiscal deficiencies. Now, Roosevelt's policy justified numerous and repeated police actions in dysfunctional Caribbean and Latin American countries by U.S. Marines and naval forces, and enabled the founding of the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. This approach is sometimes referred to as drumbeat gunboat diplomacy, which makes sense. It required military intervention, gunboat diplomacy, wherein naval forces and Marines land in a national capital to protect American and Western personnel, temporarily seize control of the government, and dictate policies friendly to American business, such as the repayment of foreign loans. For example, in 1905, Roosevelt sent the Marines in to occupy the Dominican Republic and established financial supervision over the Dominican government. Imperialists often framed such actions as almost humanitarian. They celebrated white Anglo-Saxon societies, such as those found in the United States and the British Empire, as advanced practitioners of nation building and civilization, helping to uplift debtor nations in Latin America that lacked the humanely qualities of discipline and self-control. Roosevelt, for instance, preached that it was the manly duty of the United States to exercise an international police power in the Caribbean and to spread the benefit of Anglo Saxon civilization to inferior states populated by inferior peoples. The president's language, for instance, contrasted debtor nations' impotence with the United States' civilizing influence beyond new ideas that associated self restraint and social stability with Anglo Saxon manliness. So you can see how these ideas cross over, these ideas of manliness with the politics, all these ideas kind of culminate together. So, dollar diplomacy, I promised you dollar diplomacy we would come back to, offered a less costly method of empire and avoided the troubles of military occupation. Washington worked with bankers to provide loans to Latin American nations in exchange for some level of control over their national fiscal and affairs. Roosevelt first implemented dollar diplomacy on a vast scale, while President Taft and Wilson continued the practice in various forms during their own administrations. All confronted instability in Latin America. Rising debts to European and American bankers allowed for the inroads of modern life that destabilized much of the region. Bankers beginning with the financial houses in London and New York saw Latin America as as an opportunity for investment. 1 second, folks. This is going to happen. as an opportunity for investment. One second. My cable. Kindle is dying. Go. Lenders took advantage of the region's newly formed government's need for cash and exacted punishing interest rates on massive loans, which were then sold off in pieces on the secondary bond market. American economic interests were now closely aligned with the region, but were often plagued by mismanagement, civil wars, and military coups. Um, in the decades following their independence. Turnover in regimes interfered with the repayment of loans, as new governments often repudiated the national debt or forced a renegotiation with suddenly powerless lenders. Creditors could not force settlements of loans until they successfully lobbied their own governments to get involved and forcibly collect debts. The Roosevelt administration did not want to deny the Europeans' rightful demands of repayment of debts, but it also did not want to encourage European policies of conquest in the hemisphere as part of the debt collection. U.S. policymakers and military strategists within the Roosevelt administration determined that the European practice of military intervention posed a serious threat to American interests in the region. Roosevelt reasoned that the United States must create and maintain fiscal and political stability within strategically important nations in Latin America, particularly those affecting routes to and from the proposed Panama Canal Avenue as a Panama Canal, pardon me. As a result, U.S. policymakers considered interventions in places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic a necessity to ensure security around the region. So ultimately, the Monroe Doctrine provided the Roosevelt administration with a diplomatic and international legal tradition through which it could be assert a U.S. right and obligation to intervene in the hemisphere. The Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine asserted that the United States wished to promote stable, prosperous states in Latin America that could live up to their political and financial obligations. So ultimately, Roosevelt declared that wrongdoing or any impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may finally require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the United States cannot ignore this duty. President Monroe declared what Europeans could not do in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt inverted his doctrine ultimately to legitimate direct U.S. intervention in the region. So ultimately, though aggressive and bellicose, Roosevelt did not necessarily advocate expansion by military force. In fact, the president insisted that in dealings with the Latin American nations, he did not seek national glory or expansion of territory and believed that war or intervention should be as a last resort when resolving conflicts with problematic governments. According to Roosevelt, such actions were necessary to maintain order and civilization. Then again, Roosevelt certainly believed in using military power to protect national interests and spheres of influence when absolutely necessary. He also believed that the American sphere included not only Hawaii and the Caribbean, but also much of the Pacific. So, what Japanese victories over Russia threatened the regional balance of, or when Japanese victories over Russian Russia threatened the regional balance of power. He sponsored peace talks between Russian and Japanese leaders, earning him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. So now we are up to slide 11. I do apologize for skipping over slide 10. Slide 11, women and independence, or women imperialism, excuse me. Debates over American imperialism revolved around more than just politics and economics and national self interest. They also included notions of humanitarianism, morality, religion, and ideas of civilization. And they just included significant participation by American women. So we see the story in your textbook about Margaret McLeod and how she was recruited to become kind of this representative demonstrator for the Heinz Company and toured around the world. Um, so wherever she went, this dainty young girl with golden hair in white cap and tucker drew attention to Heinz products. But in a much larger sense, she was also projecting an image of middle class American domesticity, of pure womanhood. Heinz saw itself not only as purveying economical and healthful foodstuffs. It was bringing the blessings of civilization to the world. When commentators such as Theodore Roosevelt, in his speech on the strenuous life, spoke about America's overseas ventures, they generally gave the impression that this was a strictly masculine enterprise. The work of soldiers, sailors, government officials, explorers, businessmen, and scientists. But in fact, in U.S. imperialism, which focused as much on economic and cultural influence as on military and political power, offered a range of opportunities for white middle class Christian women. In addition to working as representatives on American business, women could serve as missionaries, teachers, and medical professionals. And as artists and writers, they were inspired by help transmitting ideas about imperialism. So, moreover, the rhetoric of civilization that underlie imperialism was itself a highly gendered concept. According to the racial theory of the day, humans progressed through their hierarchical stages of civilization in an orderly, linear fashion. Only Europeans and Americans had attained the highest level of civilization, which was superficially marked by whiteness, but also included an industrial economy and a gender division in which men and women had diverging but complementary roles. Social and technological progress had freed women of the burden of physical labor and elevated them to a position of moral and spiritual authority, which white women, excuse me, thus potentially had important roles to play in U.S. imperialism, both as symbols of the benefits of American civilization and as vehicles for the transmission of American values. So let's take a break here and resume right after that. Let's start again. Moreover, the rhetoric of civilization that underlay imperialism was itself a highly gendered concept. According to the racial theory of the day, humans progressed through hierarchical stages of civilization in an orderly, linear fashion. Only Europeans and Americans had attained the highest level of civilization, which was superficially marked by whiteness, but also included an industrial economy and a gender division in which men and women had diverging but complementary roles. social and technological progress had freed women of the burdens of physical labor and elevated them to a position of moral and spiritual authority. White women thus potentially had important roles to play in U.S. imperialism, both as symbols of the benefits of American civilization and as vehicles for the transmission of American virtue values. Civilization, while often cloaked in the language of morality and Christianity, was very much an economic concept. The stages of civilization were primarily marked by their economic character: hunter gatherer, agricultural, industrial, and the consumption of industrially produced commodities was seen as a key moment in the progress of savages towards civilized life. So, over the course of the 19th century, women in the West, for instance, had become closely associated with consumption, particularly of those commodities used in the domestic sphere. Thus, it must have seemed natural for Alexander McWillie to hire Margaret McLeod to demonstrate ketchup and chili sauce at the same time as she demonstrated white middle class domesticity. By adopting the use of such progressive products in their homes, consumers could potentially absorb even the virtues of American civilization. So, in some ways, women's work in support of imperialism can be seen as an extension of the kind of activities many of them were already engaging in among working class immigrant and Native American communities in the United States. Many white women felt that they had a duty to spread the benefits of Christian civilization to those less fortunate than themselves. American overseas ventures then merely expanded the scope of these activities, literally, in that the geographical range of possibilities encompassed practically the entire globe, and figuratively, in that imperialism significantly raised the stakes of women's work. No longer only responsible for shaping the next generation of American citizens, white women now had a crucial role to play in the maintenance of civilization itself. They too would help determine whether civilization would continue to progress. Of course, not all women were active supporters of U.S. imperialism. Many actively opposed it, although the most prominent public voices against imperialism were male. Women made up a large proportion of the membership of organizations like the Anti Imperialist League. For white women like Jane Addams and Josephine Shaw Lowell, anti imperialist activities was an outgrowth of their work in the opposition to violence and in support of democracy. Black female activists, meanwhile, generally viewed imperialism as a form of racial antagonism and drew parallels between the treatments of African Americans at home and, for example, Filipinos abroad. Indeed, Ida B. Wells viewed her anti lynching campaign as a kind of anti imperialist activism. So we now come to, if I can get it to advance, click on here, immigration. So, for Americans at the turn of the century, imperialism and immigration were two sides of the same coin. The involvement of American women with imperialist and anti imperialist activity demonstrates how foreign policy concerns were brought home and became, in a sense, domesticated. It is also no coincidence that many of the women involved in both imperialist and anti imperialist organizations were also concerned with the plight of new arrivals to the United States. Industrialization, imperialism, and immigration were all linked. Imperialism had at its core a desire for markets for American goods, and those goods were increasingly manufactured by immigrant labor. This sense of growing dependence on others as producers and consumers, along with doubts about the capability of assimilation into the mainstream of white Protestant American society, caused a great deal of anxiety among native born Americans. Between 1870 and 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the United States. This migration was largely a continuation of a process begun before the Civil War. Though by the turn of the 20th century, new groups such as Italians, Poles, and Eastern European Jews made up a larger percentage of the arrivals, while the Irish and German numbers began to dwindle. Although the growing U.S. economy needed large numbers of immigrant workers for its factories and mills, many Americans reacted negatively to the arrival of so many immigrants. Nativists opposed mass immigration for various reasons. Some felt that the new arrivals were unfit for American democracy and that the Irish or Italian immigrants used violence or bribery to corrupt municipal governments. Others, often earlier immigrants themselves, worried that the arrival of even more immigrants would result in fewer jobs and lower wages. Such fears combined and resulted in anti-Chinese protests on the West Coast in the 1870s. Still others worried that immigrants brought with them radical ideas such as socialism and communism. These fears multiplied after the Chicago Haymarket Affair in 1886, in which immigrants were accused of killing police officers in a bomb blast. In September 1876, Franklin Benjamin Sanborn, a member of the Massachusetts Board of State Charities, gave an address in support of the introduction of regulatory federal immigration legislation at an interstate conference of charity officials in Saratoga, New York. Immigration might bring uh, federal immigration legislation at an interstate conference of charity officials in Saratoga, New York. Immigration might bring some benefits, but it also introduces disease, ignorance, crime, pauperism, and idleness. Sanborn thus advocated federal action to stop indiscriminate and unregulated immigration. Sanborn's address was aimed at restricting only the immigration of paupers from Europe to the East Coast, but the idea of immigration restrictions was common across the United States in the late 19th century, with many variously feared that the influx of foreigners would undermine the racial, economic, and moral integrity of American society. From the 1870s to the 1920s, the federal government passed a series of laws limiting or discontinuing the immigration of particular groups, and the United States to remained committed to regulating the kind of immigrants who would join American society. To critics, regulations legitimized racism, class bias, and ethnic prejudice as formal national policy. The first move for federal immigration control came from California, where racial hostility towards Chinese immigrants had mounted since the mid 19th century. In addition to accusing Chinese immigrants of racial inferiority and unfitness for American citizenship, opponents claimed that they were also economically and morally corrupting American society with cheap labor and immoral practices such as prostitution. Now, think about that for a second, folks. That prostitution did not exist until the Chinese introduced it. Wait a second. Prostitution was here long before the Chinese came and is still here. So the argument sounds a little flawed, to say the least. Immigration restriction was necessary for the Caucasian race of California, as one anti-Chinese politician declared, and for European Americans to preserve and maintain their homes, their business, and their high social and moral position. In 1875, the anti-Chinese crusade in California moved Congress to pass the Page Act, which banned the entry of convicted criminals, Asian laborers brought in voluntarily, and women imported for the purposes of prostitution, a stricture designed chiefly to exclude Chinese women. Then in May 1882, Congress suspended the immigration of all Chinese laborers with the Chinese Exclusion Act, making the Chinese the first immigrant group subject to admission restrictions on the basis of race. They became the first illegal immigrants On the other side of the country, Atlantic seaboard states also facilitated the formation of federal immigration policy. Since the colonial period, East Coast states had regulated immigration through their own passenger laws, which prohibited the landing of destitute foreigners unless ship masters prepaid certain amounts of money in the support of these passengers. State level control of pauper immigration developed into federal policy in the early 1880s. In August 1882, Congress passed the Immigration Act denying admission to people who were not able to support themselves, and those such as paupers, people with mental illnesses, or convicted criminals who might otherwise threaten the security of the nation. So it's obvious that immigration restrictions are not something that is a modern invention, an invention of our day. These have been around since the beginning of our country. The category of excludable people expanded continuously after 1882. So you heard that phrase. It has changed. The excludable group. In 1885, in response to American workers' complaints about cheap immigrant labor, Congress added foreign workers migrating under labor contracts with American employers to the list of excludable people. 6 years later, the federal government included people who seemed likely to become wards of the state, people with contagious diseases, and polygamists, and made all groups of excludable people deportable. In 1903, those who would pose ideological threats to American Republican democracy, such as anarchists and socialists, and also became the subject of new immigration restrictions. Many immigration critics were responding to the shifting demographics of American immigration. The center of immigrant sending regions shifted from Northern and Western Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. These new immigrants were poor, spoke languages other than English, and were likely Catholic or Jewish. White Protestant Americans typically regarded them as inferior, and American immigration policy